The sound of shattering glass didn't belong in a building like Meridian Tower. Owen Mitchell paused, mop suspended mid-stroke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their steady buzz suddenly intrusive against the abrupt silence that followed. The sound had come from somewhere high above the executive floors. He tilted his head, listening. Nothing but the gentle hum of the server room behind him and his own measured breathing. Then the freight elevator doors slid open. A woman stumbled out, her expensive heels, abandoned in one hand pressed against her side, where a dark stain spread across her white blouse. Her tailored blazer hung torn at the shoulder, and her eyes, those eyes he'd seen commanding boardrooms on financial news networks, were wide with something beyond fear. Alexandra Hayes, CEO of DataSphere. She saw him standing there in his gray uniform, mop in hand, and froze. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking on the single syllable. "Don't." Owen didn't move. "Don't what?" "Call security. Call anyone." Her gaze darted to the emergency phone on the wall. "You don't know what's happening." "I know enough," he said quietly, setting the mop against the wall. "You're bleeding through what looks like a $1,000 blouse and hiding in a service elevator. That narrows it down." Something in his tone made her pause. The elevator doors began to close, and she thrust her arm out to stop them, wincing as the motion pulled at whatever injury she was hiding. "You need help," Owen said, stepping forward. "I need to disappear." She straightened, summoning some fragment of the composure that had made her one of the most formidable executives in tech. "There's a way out that doesn't trigger the security protocols. Through the maintenance tunnels." Owen's eyes narrowed. "How would you know about those?" "I designed this building." A hint of pride flashed through the fear. "I know where it leaks." He studied her for a long moment. Whatever trouble she was in, it wasn't his. He had enough complications in his life, a daughter waiting at home with the babysitter bills piling up, and memories he couldn't seem to sweep away, no matter how many floors he mopped. But something in her desperation resonated with him. He'd seen that look before in his own mirror 3 years ago. "Service exits this way," he said, finally gesturing toward a nondescript door. "Cameras are old, half don't work." Relief flooded her face, but she didn't move. "Why are you helping me?" Owen shrugged. "I don't like seeing people crawl when they used to fly by." That stopped her cold. Something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps regret. "You were in defense tech," she said slowly. "Before this." He felt his spine stiffen. "What, Mitchell?" "Owen Mitchell from the Cassini project at NASA, one of the whistleblowers." Her voice steadied slightly. "You were blacklisted." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the building systems and the soft ping of the elevator attempting to close its doors again. "So," he said at last, "you know who I am. I know you believed in something enough to lose everything for it." She clutched the bundle she carried closer to her chest. "I don't meet many people like that anymore." Owen pushed open the service door. "Come on, before you pass out and I have to explain you to my daughter." The house was small, settled in a quiet neighborhood just far enough from the city to see stars on clear nights. It wasn't much, a modest two-bedroom with worn furniture and walls that needed fresh paint, but it was clean and warm and safe. Or it had been until tonight. Alexandra sat on the edge of Owen's couch, a mug of untouched tea cooling between her palms. Her side was bandaged now, the wound a deep graze cleaned and dressed with supplies from the first aid kit Owen kept fully stocked. Old habits from another life. "It's not deep enough for a hospital," he'd told her as he worked his hands steady and impersonal, "but deep enough to worry about." Now he stood by the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the empty street outside. The babysitter had left an hour ago, confused by the sudden appearance of a strange woman, but smart enough not to ask questions when Owen slipped her an extra 20. "You should rest," he said, turning back to Alexandra. "Guest rooms down the hall. We'll figure out next steps in the morning." She looked up, fingers tightening around the mug. "There's something you should know first." "There's a lot I should know," he countered. "Like who shot you, like why the CEO of DataSphere is hiding in a janitor's house instead of calling her security team, like what's in that package you won't let go of." He nodded toward the scarf-wrapped bundle she'd set beside her on the couch. Alexandra glanced down at it. "The truth," she said simply, "or enough of it to burn everything down." A small voice interrupted from the hallway. "Daddy." Owen turned, his expression softening instantly. "Sophie?" You should be asleep, Bug. A girl of about 8 stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, oversized space-themed pajamas, hanging off her slender frame. She clutched a sketchbook to her chest, eyes fixed not on her father, but on Alexandra. Is she hurt? Sophie asked. Just a little, Alexandra answered before Owen could, her voice gentler than he'd heard it. Your dad helped me. Sophie nodded solemnly as if this explained everything. She assumed. He's good at helping. He has steady hands. She took a step into the room. Are you running away from something scary? Owen moved to intercept his daughter, placing his hands on her shoulders. That's enough questions for tonight, astronaut. Back to bed. But Sophie wiggled free, approaching Alexandra with the fearlessness of childhood. She held out her sketchbook. I drew something for when I get scared. You can borrow it. Alexandra hesitated, then took the offered book. Inside was a drawing of the night sky stars scattered across black paper in white and silver. In the center floated a woman with delicate wings, arms spread wide among the constellations. I gave her wings, Sophie explained, so she can fly away if the scary things come too close. Alexandra stared at the drawing, something unreadable crossing her face. Her hand trembled slightly as she traced the outline of the winged figure. That's beautiful, she said finally, her voice thick. What's your name? Sophie Mitchell. The girl smiled. I like drawing better than naming things, though. Owen watched the exchange with a strange tightness in his chest. There was something disarming about seeing Alexandra Hayes, the woman whose algorithms had reshaped modern communication, whose company was valued at billions, rendered speechless by his daughter's simple kindness. I'm hungry, Sophie announced, turning to her father. It's after midnight, Owen said, lifting her gently. You'll turn into a raccoon. A space raccoon, she corrected, wrapping her arms around his neck. As Owen carried Sophie back to her bedroom, Alexandra continued to stare at the drawing. By the time he returned, he found her looking more lost than when she'd stumbled out of the elevator. Not from fear now, but from something that looked strangely like recognition. She has her mother's talent, Alexandra said quietly. Owen froze in the doorway. How would you know that? Alexandra closed the sketchbook carefully and set it aside. She unwrapped the bundle she'd been guarding, revealing a sleek external hard drive with a single word scrawled across its surface in permanent marker: truth. Because I knew Rebecca, she said, and this is what got her killed. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds in thin golden stripes, catching dust motes as they drifted lazily through the air. Owen stood at the counter, coffee mug, warming his palms, watching Alexandra Hayes sleep on his couch. She hadn't made it to the guest room after all. Their conversation had stretched until dawn, until words became too heavy and silence took their place. Rebecca. His wife's name in Alexandra's mouth had felt like a violation until she started talking, until the pieces started falling into place. The official story was simple. Rebecca Mitchell, test pilot, had died in a catastrophic equipment failure 3 years ago. Tragic accident. Case closed. Only it wasn't closed not for Owen, who'd spent months afterward piecing together fragments of projects she'd mentioned, encrypted files she'd hidden, late-night phone calls she'd taken in whispers. And now Alexandra Hayes, the woman whose company had partnered with the aerospace program that employed Rebecca, was asleep on his couch, claiming his wife had discovered something worth killing for. The hard drive sat on the kitchen table between them, innocent and ominous, all at once. Alexandra stirred, then sat up with a wince hand going to her injured side. She looked smaller in daylight, more human than the CEO persona she projected to the world. Her eyes found Owen's immediately. You've been standing there a while, she observed, trying to decide if I believe you. He set his mug down. About Rebecca. Alexandra pushed herself upright. I understand your skepticism. Do you? His voice remained even controlled. You show up bleeding, claiming to know things about my dead wife, dangling some conspiracy that conveniently ties to whatever trouble you're in now. He gestured to the hard drive. That could be filled with corporate secrets you're trying to hide. This could be some elaborate scheme to use me for. What? Protection as scapegoat. If I wanted protection, I could afford better than a maintenance worker's spare room. She stood straightening her borrowed clothes, an old t-shirt and sweatpants that hung loose on her frame. And if I needed a scapegoat, I wouldn't pick someone with a child. Owen's jaw tightened. Then convince me. Alexandra walked to the table and placed her hand on the hard drive. Your wife was consulting on neural interface technology for DataSphere's aerospace division. Officially, she was a former FA-18 Super Hornet test pilot, analyzing pilot response patterns during critical flight scenarios on the X-45 UCAV program. Unofficially, she was helping integrate our predictive algorithms into flight systems. Rebecca was a pilot, not a tech consultant. She was both. Alexandra held his gaze. She was brilliant, Owen. She saw patterns others missed. That's why we recruited her. Owen crossed his arms. And found. And she discovered something in the code, backdoors, functions that went beyond safety protocols or performance enhancement. Alexandra's voice dropped. Functions designed to override pilot decisions based on parameters set remotely. The implication hung in the air between them. Owen felt the room tilt slightly. You're saying someone could control the aircraft without the pilot knowing? Alexandra nodded, or influence the pilot's neural responses directly. Subtle enough to seem like their own decision-making, dramatic enough to change outcomes. Owen's mind raced through the possibilities, the applications, the dangers. That's military-grade human manipulation technology masquerading as safety features. Alexandra finished for him. Rebecca found it, documented it, and contacted me directly because she knew I would understand the code. I was scheduled to meet her the day she died. Owen turned away, bracing himself against the counter. The familiar pain rushed back: Rebecca's funeral, the closed casket, the official statements that never quite answered his questions. The way his security clearance had been quietly revoked a week later. The job offers that disappeared. The sudden move to a new city with Sophie. Why come to me now, he asked finally, after 3 years? Alexandra's expression hardened. Because they've perfected it. It's no longer experimental, no longer limited to specialized equipment. They've integrated it into DataSphere's consumer products, phones, home assistants, even children's learning apps. She tapped the hard drive. Everything's here. The code architecture, the implementation timeline, the first test subjects. Owen turned back to her. And someone at DataSphere tried to stop you from exposing this. Not someone. Her voice was bitter now. The board, my own security team, my father. A small sound from the hallway made them both turn. Sophie stood there in her pajamas, hair wild from sleep, clutching her sketchbook. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Alexandra with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. You knew my mom, she asked softly. Alexandra's expression softened. I did. She was very brave. Sophie walked slowly into the kitchen, stopping at the table. She opened her sketchbook and flipped through several pages before turning it around to show them. The drawing made Owen's breath catch in his throat. It was a detailed sketch of a cockpit rendered with surprising accuracy for a child. In the pilot's seat sat a woman with her hand reaching toward a strange pattern of lights on the instrument panel. Above her, through the cockpit window, stars formed the same pattern. I dream about her sometimes, Sophie said simply. She's always trying to show me something in the stars. Alexandra glanced at Owen, then back at the drawing. May I? She asked, reaching for the sketchbook. Sophie nodded, and Alexandra examined the pattern more closely. These aren't random, she murmured, tracing the arrangement of stars. This is... She stopped, looking up at Owen with newfound urgency. Your daughter's been drawing coordinates. Before Owen could process this, a phone rang, his landline, rarely used except by Sophie's school. He crossed to the wall and answered. Mitchell residence. The voice on the other end was mechanical, filtered. If you want to keep your current residence intact, step outside. Alone. Owen's grip tightened on the receiver. Through the kitchen window, he caught sight of a black SUV parked across the street. Who is this? Someone who knows exactly what Alexandra Hayes brought into your home. A pause, Fitidons, and exactly how much your daughter remembers about her mother's work. The line went dead. Owen turned slowly to find Alexandra already gathering the hard drive, her face set in grim determination. They found us, she said. It wasn't a question. Sophie looked between them, confusion giving way to fear. Daddy, Owen crossed to his daughter and knelt before her, hands gentle on her shoulders. Remember our comet drill? When we need to move fast and quiet. She nodded, instantly solemn. Go pack your backpack, just like we practiced. As Sophie disappeared down the hall, Owen turned to Alexandra. There's a cabin about 3 hours north. My friend Elena owns it. We can't involve more people, Alexandra protested. We already have. Owen nodded toward where Sophie had been standing. And Elena Reyes isn't just anyone. She's a civil rights attorney who specializes in corporate whistleblower cases. He met Alexandra's gaze steadily, and she's been looking into Datasphere for years. Something like hope flickered in Alexandra's eyes. You trust her? A complicated expression crossed Owen's face. With Sophie's life, yes. He glanced toward the window where the black SUV remained parked waiting. With everything else, we're about to find out. Outside, a car door opened. The cabin nestled against the edge of Blackwater Lake like it had grown there naturally weathered cedar siding, blending with the surrounding pines. No visible neighbors, no paved roads leading to it, just a gravel path that wound through dense forest before opening to this hidden pocket of calm. Owen killed the engine of the old pickup truck he'd borrowed from his neighbor, replacing the familiar hum with the gentle sounds of the forest wind through branches, distant bird calls, the soft lapping of water against the shore. Beside him, Alexandra gazed out at the stillness, the hard drive clutched in her lap like a talisman. In the back seat, Sophie had finally fallen asleep, her backpack serving as a pillow, colored pencils spilled across the seat beside her. Their escape had been narrow, a frantic dash through the back door, as footsteps approached the front, cutting through neighboring yards until they reached Mrs. Abernathy's house 3 blocks over. The old woman had asked no questions when Owen requested to borrow her late husband's truck, just handed him the keys with a knowing look that suggested she'd done something similar in her own past. This is remote, Alexandra said quietly, careful not to wake Sophie. That's the point. Owen opened his door, the hinges protesting with a creak. Elena's family has owned this place for generations. No internet, no cell service unless you climb the ridge. Perfect place to disappear. Alexandra followed him out of the truck. Or to make a stand. Owen didn't respond to that. Instead, he opened the rear door and gently lifted his sleeping daughter, cradling her against his chest with practiced ease. She stirred but didn't wake, one hand automatically finding its place against his shoulder. The cabin door opened before they reached it. Elena Reyes stood in the threshold, a study in composed vigilance. Tall and angular with close-cropped silver hair that contrasted sharply with her dark skin, she projected an aura of calm authority that had served her well in courtrooms across the country. Her eyes took in the scene with swift assessment, Owen carrying Sophie Alexandra trailing behind with the hard drive, the borrowed truck. You made good time, she said simply, stepping aside to let them enter. The interior was modest but comfortable. A large main room with a stone fireplace, open kitchen, and stairs leading to a loft. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with legal texts and dog-eared paperbacks. A laptop sat open on a sturdy wooden table surrounded by stacks of documents. Sophie can take the bedroom downstairs, Elena said, nodding toward a door off the main room. I'll sleep in the loft. Owen carried his daughter into the indicated room, emerging a moment later without her. He found Alexandra and Elena engaged in a silent appraisal of each other. So Elena said finally, Alexandra Hayes. O Saranta Neves, the architect behind Datasphere's predictive behavior models. And you're Elena Reyes, the attorney who's filed 3 FOI requests targeting my company in the past year. Alexandra's tone was neutral, but her posture had shifted back to the CEO Owen had first encountered, spine straight, chin lifted, eyes alert. Elena's mouth curved in a hint of a smile. 4, actually. The last one is still working its way through the system. She gestured to the table. I've been building a case for years, but I've been missing key pieces. Alexandra set the hard drive on the table. I think I have what you need. Elena studied it, then looked up at Owen. And Rebecca, is she part of this too? The question hung in the air. Owen felt a familiar tightness in his chest whenever his wife's name was spoken aloud, a mixture of grief and something darker, more complicated. Yes, he said finally, more than we knew. Elena nodded once as if confirming a long-held suspicion. Then let's see what you've brought me. As they gathered around the table, Owen noticed Alexandra watching him with an unreadable expression. You never told me how you know Elena, she said quietly. Something passed between Owen and Elena, a shared history communicated in a single glance. We were engaged, Elena answered for him, before Rebecca. Alexandra's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. It was a lifetime ago. Elena continued, her focus shifting to the hard drive. Before Owen decided truth was more important than career advancement. Before I learned that sometimes the most principled stand is the one that costs you everything. She looked up, meeting Owen's gaze directly. I didn't understand then. I do now. The admission hung between them, years of unspoken regret condensed into those simple words. Owen gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned to the hard drive. Let's see what Rebecca found, he said, and what Alexandra risked her life to save. The data was devastating in its scope and implications. Project Wavelength Datasphere's classified neural interface program had begun as a military contract 5 years earlier. The goal had been straightforward: if ethically dubious, develop technology that could influence decision-making in high-stress environments to improve outcomes. Soldiers who wouldn't panic under fire. Pilots who would make optimal choices when systems failed. But what it had become was something far more insidious. They're mapping neural pathways associated with decision-making, then creating algorithms that can subtly redirect them, Alexandra explained, pointing to code on Elena's laptop screen. It started with direct neural interfaces headsets for pilots, implants for military personnel, but they found they could achieve similar results with less invasive methods. Sound patterns, Owen said, scrolling through a file of test results. Visual stimuli, even specific word combinations. Elena leaned closer. You're saying they can influence behavior through standard devices? Phones, computers? Alexandra nodded grimly. That's what made it so valuable. No specialized equipment needed, just regular consumer tech with the right programming. Subtle enough that users don't realize they're being influenced, powerful enough to shift purchasing decisions, voting behavior, even emotional responses to news events. Mind control through smartphones, Elena murmured. Not control, Alexandra corrected. Influence, nudges that accumulate over time. The perfect intersection of psychology and technology. Owen stared at the screen, a sick feeling growing in his stomach as he recognized elements of what Rebecca had described to him in fragments before her death. Weekend projects she couldn't discuss, concerns about system autonomy that she'd voice late at night, then dismiss in the morning. And Rebecca discovered this, he asked. Alexandra's expression softened. She didn't just discover it, she was building a kill switch. She pulled up another file, lines of code, annotated in a style Owen recognized immediately as his wife's. She found vulnerabilities in the system, ways to disrupt the influence patterns using the same delivery mechanisms. A back door to the back door, Elena said with grudging admiration. Exactly, but before she could implement it, Alexandra trailed off. Her plane crashed. Owen finished, his voice hollow. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Outside, twilight had settled over the lake, painting the water in deepening shades of blue and purple. Inside, the three adults sat with the weight of what they'd uncovered. This is enough to bring down Datasphere, Elena said finally. Maybe more than that. Government contracts, military applications, privacy violations on an unprecedented scale. It's not enough, Alexandra interrupted. Not yet. We have the what, but not the who. Not the complete implementation network. She looked at Owen. And without that, the same people who arranged Rebecca's accident will make sure this evidence disappears before it reaches any courtroom. Owen pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. I need some air. Neither woman tried to stop him as he headed for the door. Outside, the night air was cool against his face, carrying the scent of pine and lake water. He walked to the edge of the dock that extended into the lake, the weathered boards creaking softly beneath his feet. Stars had begun to appear overhead, pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. Rebecca had loved the stars, had taught Sophie the constellations before the girl could even speak in full sentences, had joked that heaven was just the space between stars, close enough to see, but too far to touch. Owen sat at the edge of the dock, feet dangling above the water, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what they'd learned. Not just that Rebecca had been murdered, but that she died fighting against something enormous, something that had continued to grow in her absence. And now Sophie was drawing coordinates from her dreams, patterns that matched what was in Rebecca's code. A soft footfall on the dock announced he wasn't alone. He didn't turn, already recognizing Alexandra's tentative step. I'm sorry, she said, stopping a few feet behind him. For what part? His voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. All of it, not seeing what was happening sooner, not protecting Rebecca, bringing this to your door. Owen looked up at the stars. Why did you really? There must have been other options, other allies. Alexandra was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its CEO confidence, revealing something more vulnerable beneath. Because she made me promise, she said softly. If anything happened to her, I was to find you, bring you what she'd discovered. A pause. She said you'd know what to do with it. Owen turned to look at her, then searching her face for deception and finding only exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. Why wait 3 years? Alexandra sat down beside him, her gaze fixed on the dark water. I didn't believe it at first. Thought her concerns were, exaggerated. By the time I realized the truth that they were watching me too closely, it took time to gather evidence to create an exit strategy. She looked at him. And to find you, you disappeared pretty thoroughly after the funeral. Owen nodded slowly. That had been intentional, new city, new name for Sophie at school, cash-only lifestyle. The paranoia that had seemed excessive then felt justified now. What happens next, he asked. We complete what Rebecca started, Alexandra said simply. We build the kill switch, and then we make sure everyone knows what they've been exposed to. Owen considered this, weighing the risks against the alternative, doing nothing, allowing Sophie to grow up in a world where her thoughts weren't entirely her own. There's something else, Alexandra added hesitantly. Something I haven't shared with Elena yet. Owen waited. I think Sophie is more connected to this than we realize. Alexandra chose her words carefully. Rebecca's code, the kill switch she was designing, it's keyed to specific neural patterns. Patterns I've only seen in one other place. She met his eyes. In Sophie's drawings. Owen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What are you saying? I'm saying Rebecca may have hidden the key to her work in the one place they'd never think to look. Alexandra's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. In her daughter's mind. From the cabin behind them came the sound of the door opening. Elena stood in the rectangle of warm light, her silhouette sharp against the glow. You both need to see this, she called, her normally composed voice edged with urgency. Now! As they hurried back to the cabin, Owen felt the night press in around them, the stars suddenly watchful, the darkness between them, no longer empty, but filled with unseen signals, invisible wavelengths carrying messages he was only beginning to understand. Inside, Elena had the television turned to a news channel. On screen, Owen saw his own house surrounded by police vehicles, lights flashing against the darkened windows. Where authorities are investigating a potential connection to corporate espionage involving tech giant Datasphere, the reporter was saying. Sources close to the investigation have identified the homeowner as Owen Mitchell, a former NASA contractor with a history of questionable activities. The camera cut to a photograph of Owen, an old ID badge photo alongside a professional headshot of Alexandra. While Datasphere CEO Alexandra Hayes remains missing, after what company representatives are calling a targeted attack on their secure systems. In a statement released this evening, Datasphere Chairman Walter Hayes expressed concern for his daughter's safety. The image changed to show an older man with Alexandra's sharp features softened by an expression of practiced concern. My daughter has been under tremendous pressure, Walter Hayes said, his voice grave with paternal worry. We have reason to believe she may be experiencing a psychological break, possibly being manipulated by individuals with a vendetta against our company. We only want her safe return and appropriate care. Alexandra's face had gone pale. He's setting the stage, she whispered, making sure anything I reveal will be dismissed as the ravings of an unstable mind. Owen barely heard her. His attention was fixed on the footage of his home, the neighborhood where he'd tried to build a safe, anonymous life for Sophie. All exposed now, all compromised. They'll know we're gone, he said. They'll start looking. Elena muted the television, which is why we need to move quickly. She turned to Alexandra. Whatever you're planning to do with that data, we need to do it now, before they control the entire narrative. Alexandra nodded slowly, her shock giving way to resolve. We need to reach someone who can amplify the truth without being silenced. Someone with a platform they don't control. I might know someone, Elena said, an independent journalist who specializes in corporate malfeasance. Remember him? She runs a subscriber-based platform outside traditional media channels. Owen's mind was still on Sophie sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware that her life had just been upended again. And Sophie, if what Alexandra says is true, if Rebecca somehow encoded information in her subconscious, then we need to understand what she knows, Elena finished for him, without putting her at risk. A small voice spoke from the hallway. I know what Mom was trying to show me. All three adults turned to find Sophie standing in the doorway, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. Her eyes were clear, unfrightened, filled with a certainty that seemed at odds with her rumpled pajamas and tousled hair. "It's a song," she said simply. "The stars make a song." Owen crossed to his daughter kneeling before her. "What do you mean, bug?" Sophie opened her sketchbook to reveal a new drawing, lines and dots arranged in what looked like musical notation stars, serving as notes on an unconventional staff. "Mom used to hum it when she thought I was sleeping," Sophie explained, "and now I hear it in my dreams, but it's the stars singing." She looked up at Alexandra. "You know it too. I can tell." Alexandra approached slowly, studying the drawing. Recognition dawned on her face. "It's a frequency pattern," she breathed, "part of Rebecca's kill switch." She looked at Owen. "Your wife encoded the disruption sequence as a melody, something Sophie would remember, something that would seem innocent to anyone else." Elena joined them, examining the drawing with newfound respect. "A lullaby as a weapon," she murmured. "Brilliant." Owen felt a surge of pride mixed with grief so acute it was physical. Even in death, Rebecca was protecting them, fighting for them. Sophie touched his arm gently. "Daddy, are the bad people from your old job coming after us again?" The question, so innocent, so knowing, caught him off guard. He'd never told Sophie the real reason for their move, their change of names, their new life. He'd thought he was protecting her from the truth. But perhaps Rebecca had known better. Perhaps she'd understood that Sophie would need to know, would need to be prepared. "Yes," he said simply, "but we're going to stop them. With your help." Sophie nodded solemnly. "That's what Mom said you'd say." She turned the page in her sketchbook to reveal another drawing, a woman with wings flying toward a bright light. Beneath it, in a child's careful handwriting, "Sometimes the stars need our help to keep shining." Owen stared at the words, feeling as though Rebecca were speaking directly to him across the void of years and loss. He looked up to find Alexandra watching him, her expression a mirror of his own realization. "She knew," Alexandra said softly. "She knew what they'd do, what would happen. And she prepared for it. Prepared Sophie." Owen stood, gathering his daughter into his arms. "Then we don't let her down," he said, his voice finding new strength. "We finish what she started." Outside, the night deepened, stars burning against the darkness with patient, ancient light. Inside, four people bound by loss and purpose, and a melody only one of them could fully hear, began to plan how they might redirect the invisible wavelengths that shaped the world, how they might reclaim the truth from those who sought to distort it. And somewhere, perhaps in the space between stars, Rebecca Mitchell watched over them all. Morning arrived at the cabin in gentle increments. First the pale glow of pre-dawn filtering through pine branches, then the chorus of birds announcing the sun before it crested the eastern ridge. Finally, the golden light itself spilling across the lake in rippling pathways. Owen stood at the kitchen window watching this progression with the attention of a man who had learned to notice details, to find patterns in the seemingly random. He'd been awake for hours, sleep having abandoned him sometime in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. Behind him, the cabin was quiet. Sophie still slept curled in the downstairs bedroom with her sketchbook beside her pillow. Elena had finally retired to the loft around 3 a.m. after hours of analyzing data from the hard drive and making encrypted calls from a satellite phone she'd produced from a hidden compartment in the cabin floor. Alexandra had fallen asleep at the table, head pillowed on her arms beside Elena's laptop. Owen had draped a blanket over her shoulders sometime in the night, a gesture that felt oddly intimate given the circumstances. Now, in the strengthening light of morning, he studied her face in repose. Sleep softened the sharp edges of her CEO persona, revealing something more vulnerable beneath. It was easy to forget that Alexandra Hayes was barely 40, her rise to corporate power, having come with remarkable speed and at considerable personal cost, if the absence of family photos in her official profiles was any indication. What had driven her to this point? What had made the architect of DataSphere's most profitable technologies turn against her own creation? He wasn't entirely convinced it was just loyalty to Rebecca's memory. As if sensing his scrutiny, Alexandra stirred, lifting her head with a slight wince. Her eyes found his immediately alert despite the creases on her cheek from the laptop edge. "How long was I out?" she asked, voice rough with sleep. "Few hours." Owen turned from the window, moving to the coffee maker he'd set up earlier. "Coffee," she nodded, stretching carefully to avoid aggravating her injured side. "Any developments?" Elena made contact with her journalist friend, someone named Mira Patel. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it before her. Apparently, she runs something called the Undercurrent Subscription-Based Investigative Reporting, completely independent. Alexandra wrapped her hands around the mug, absorbing its warmth. I know her work. She exposed that pharmaceutical price-fixing scheme last year. A small approving nod. Good choice. Owen leaned against the counter, cradling his own mug. She wants documented evidence in a direct interview with both of us. Alexandra's posture stiffened slightly. When today she's driving up from the city, that's risky. We don't know who else might be tracking her movements. Owen shrugged. Elena trusts her, says she takes extraordinary precautions with sources. He took a sip of his coffee. Besides, we're running out of options. Your father's narrative is gaining traction. 3 news outlets have already run stories about your concerning behavior in recent weeks. Alexander's expression darkened. Of course they have. He's on the board of their parent companies. She set down her mug with deliberate control. What he's doing, it's classic gaslighting on a corporate scale. Make everyone question the messenger so they ignore the message. It's working, Owen said simply. We need to counter it quickly. Alexandra studied him over the rim of her mug. You seem remarkably composed for someone whose life has just been upended. Again. Something like a smile, though without humor, crossed Owen's face. Practice, he said. After Rebecca died after the whistleblowing, I learned to operate in crisis mode. It becomes a baseline. Sophie seems equally adaptable. She's had to be. A shadow passed over his expression. I've tried to shield her, but kids absorb more than we realize. They sense the undercurrents even when we don't name them. Alexandra nodded slowly. That's what makes Rebecca's strategy so brilliant. Children's minds are more plastic, more receptive to patterns adults might dismiss. By encoding her kill switch as a melody, as star patterns, she ensured Sophie would retain it even if she didn't understand it. Owen's grip tightened on his mug. You really believe that's what she did? Used our daughter as a storage device. Not a storage device, Alexandra corrected gently. A guardian. Someone whose connection to the information was organic, emotional, impossible to hack or coerce. She hesitated, then added, Rebecca talked about Sophie all the time, you know. How special she was, how intuitive, how she could hear music in patterns most people never noticed. This revelation that Rebecca had spoken of their daughter to Alexandra, had shared private observations, stirred something complicated in Owen's chest. Jealousy, perhaps, that his wife had confided in this woman. Or maybe just grief at this new glimpse of Rebecca's mind, her foresight, her love. Before he could respond, Sophie appeared in the hallway, hair tousled from sleep, but eyes bright with purpose. I had another dream, she announced without preamble, about the stars and the song. Owen set down his mug and crossed to his daughter, kneeling to her level. What did you see, Bug? Sophie rubbed her eyes. It wasn't seeing, it was hearing. The song had more parts this time. She looked past Owen to Alexandra. Can I have some paper? I need to write it down before it fades. Alexandra quickly cleared a space at the table, pushing aside laptops and documents to make room for Sophie. She produced a blank notepad and pen from her bag. Here, she said, draw whatever you remember. Sophie climbed onto a chair and bent over the paper with intense concentration. Her small hand moved across the page with surprising surety, creating not drawings this time, but what appeared to be musical notation, unconventional symbols intermixed with traditional notes. Owen watched equal parts amazed and disturbed. His daughter had taken piano lessons briefly, but nothing that would explain this level of musical knowledge. This was Rebecca's influence reaching through time and memory to guide Sophie's hand. Elena appeared on the stairs from the loft, fully dressed despite the early-hour hair damp from a shower. She paused, taking in the scene at the table. What's happening? She asked quietly, joining Owen. Sophie had another dream, he explained in an undertone. She's transcribing it. Elena watched the girl work, her expression thoughtful. Mira will be here around noon, she said. She's bringing equipment to secure our digital footprint and document everything properly. She glanced at Owen. She also ran a deep background check on Alexandra overnight. Owen raised an eyebrow. And her story checks out. The board meeting minutes, the gradual estrangement from her father, the pattern of growing concerns about Project Wavelength. Mira found internal memos where Alexandra tried to implement ethical guardrails that were repeatedly overruled. And this confirmation of Alexandra's account should have been reassuring, but Owen found himself wondering what else Mira's investigation had uncovered. About Alexandra, about him, about the connections they were only beginning to understand. Done, Sophie announced, sitting back from her work. The three adults gathered around to examine what she'd created. It was indeed a form of musical notation, but with unusual symbols interspersed throughout symbols that Owen recognized from programming language. Alexandra's breath caught. "This is it," she whispered. "The complete disruption sequence. The pattern that can interrupt the influence algorithms." She looked at Sophie with undisguised wonder. "How did you know how to write this?" Sophie shrugged, the gesture disarmingly childlike in contrast to what she just produced. "I just dreamed it. Like when Mom used to sing at night, but with stars instead of notes." She tilted her head, studying Alexandra with curious intensity. "You were in my dream too, with wings like in my drawing." Alexandra blinked, clearly thrown by this statement. I was," Sophie nodded matter-of-factly. "You were flying with Mom. Both of you had wings." She turned to her father. "Can I have breakfast? Now I'm starving." The mundane request broke the tension, pulling them back from cosmic revelations to immediate needs. Owen smiled, ruffling his daughter's hair. "Pancakes," he suggested. "With blueberries," Sophie confirmed, sliding off her chair. As Owen moved to the kitchen to begin breakfast preparations, Elena drew Alexandra aside, their voices dropping to a murmur as they examined Sophie's notation more closely. The morning proceeded with a strange duality, the ordinary rhythm of breakfast dishes, teeth brushing, set against the extraordinary knowledge of what they possessed, what they planned to reveal. Sophie, having delivered her mysterious message, seemed content to return to being simply a child asking Elena if she could explore the lakeshore while the adults talked. Elena agreed, with the caveat that Sophie stay within sight of the cabin's windows, a precaution that went unquestioned, as if the girl understood perfectly well why boundaries were necessary today. As Sophie headed outside, stuffing colored pencils and her sketchbook into a small backpack, Owen found himself watching her with a mixture of pride and concern. How much did she truly understand about what was happening? How much should she understand? "She'll be okay," Alexandra said quietly, appearing beside him at the window. "Children are remarkably resilient." "I know," Owen said. "That's what worries me sometimes, that she's had to be resilient at all." Alexandra was silent for a moment, then. "I never asked, how did you explain Rebecca's death to her?" Owen continued, watching his daughter, who had settled on a large rock by the water's edge and was already absorbed in her drawing. "I told her that sometimes airplanes have problems that even the best pilots can't fix," he said finally. "That her mom did everything right, but sometimes that's not enough." He swallowed. "I told her that her mom loved her more than anything in the universe, and that love doesn't stop even when people do." Alexandra nodded slowly. "That's beautiful," she said softly, "and true in its way." "It was enough," Owen said. "Until now." The implication hung between them that soon Sophie would need to know more, would have questions they might not be prepared to answer. "When this is over," Alexandra began hesitantly, "when the truth is out, what will you tell her then?" Owen turned from the window to face her directly. "The truth, he said simply. "That her mother was a hero, that she fought against something wrong and dangerous, and that she left us the tools to finish what she started." His jaw tightened. "And that the people responsible were held accountable." Alexandra held his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Even if one of those people is my father." "Especially then," Owen said without hesitation. Before Alexandra could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced an approaching vehicle. All three adults tensed, moving to positions where they could see the driveway without being immediately visible from outside. A modest blue sedan pulled up beside Elena's car. A woman emerged, small in stature, with a sleek black bob and wire-rimmed glasses. She wore hiking boots and cargo pants, looking more like a weekend nature enthusiast than an investigative journalist. Only the professional camera slung around her neck and the heavy equipment bag she hefted from the trunk suggested her true purpose. "That's Mira," Elena confirmed, relaxing slightly. She moved to the door, opening it as the journalist reached the porch. The two women embraced briefly before Elena ushered her inside, quickly closing the door behind them. "Mira Patel," Elena made the introductions. "This is Owen Mitchell and Alexandra Hayes." Mira assessed them both with shrewd, intelligent eyes. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said, her voice carrying a slight British accent. "Before we begin, I need to be absolutely clear about something." She set down her equipment bag and fixed them with a direct stare. "Once I publish this story, there's no going back. Your lives will change irrevocably. You will be targeted, discredited, possibly worse." Her gaze lingered on Owen. "Including your daughter. Are you certain this is the path you want to take?" Owen felt rather than saw Alexandra tense beside him. This was the moment of commitment, the point of no return. "We're certain," he said, speaking for both of them. "The alternative is letting them win, letting them continue to manipulate people without their knowledge or consent." Mira nodded once, seemingly satisfied. "Then let's get started." She opened her equipment bag, removing a laptop and several devices Owen didn't recognize. "First, I need to establish a secure communication channel. Then we'll record your statements separately, followed by a joint interview." As Mira set up her equipment, Owen moved to the window to check on Sophie. She remained on her rock, absorbed in her drawing, seemingly oblivious to the momentous events unfolding inside. "She'll need to be part of this too," Alexandra said quietly, joining him again. "Her drawings, the melody she transcribed, they're evidence. Proof of what Rebecca discovered and how she encoded it." Owen nodded slowly. "I know, but on her terms with boundaries. She's still a child." "Of course," Alexandra agreed. "We protect her identity, keep her face off camera." A thought occurred to Owen, then something that had been nagging at the edges of his consciousness since their escape from his house. "The drawing," he said. "The one Sophie gave you that first night at my house, with the woman with wings. You recognized it, didn't you? Not just as art, but as something specific." Alexandra hesitated, then reached into her bag and withdrew Sophie's sketchbook, carefully opening it to the drawing in question. "It wasn't just the wings," she said softly. "It was this." She pointed to the pattern of stars surrounding the winged figure. "This constellation arrangement, it's identical to the visual pattern Rebecca identified as a trigger for the neural influence algorithm, the exact sequence they use to activate receptivity in the target's brain." Owen stared at the drawing, seeing it with new eyes. "So Sophie drew both the weapon and the defense against it." "Without even knowing it," Alexandra confirmed. "Rebecca showed her both sides of the equation encoded in images a child would remember, would replicate naturally." The revelation settled over Owen like a physical weight. His daughter had been carrying this knowledge, this burden, for 3 years, expressing it through her art, so without understanding its significance. "She should have been able to just be a kid," he said, more to himself than to Alexandra. Alexandra closed the sketchbook gently. "Perhaps when this is over, she can be." From across the room, Mira called them over. "I'm ready to begin recording," she announced. "Who wants to go first?" Alexandra straightened her demeanor, shifting subtly into the composed CEO persona that had guided Datasphere through its most successful years. "I will," she said. "It starts with me, and after all, with what I built and what it became." As Alexandra seated herself before Mira's camera, Owen slipped outside to bring Sophie in from the lakeshore. The girl came willingly, curious about their visitor, but not alarmed. "Is she going to help us tell people about Mom's song?" Sophie asked as they walked back to the cabin. Owen looked down at his daughter once again, struck by how much she seemed to intuitively grasp. "Yes," he said simply. "She's going to help us make sure everyone hears it." Alexander's interview lasted nearly 2 hours. From his position in the kitchen where he was helping Sophie make sandwiches for everyone, Owen caught fragments of her testimony, technical explanations of how the influence algorithms worked, the gradual evolution of Project Wavelength from a targeted military application to a widespread consumer-level implementation, her growing realization of how the technology was being abused. "The trigger sequences are embedded in everything now," he heard her explain. "Streaming videos, social media feeds, even the hold music when you call customer service. Brief, nearly imperceptible patterns of sound or light that prime neural pathways for subsequent messaging." Mira's response was measured, probing. "And the effects? What exactly can they influence people to do?" "It's not mind control like the old MK Ultra experiments from the 60s. It's more sophisticated, similar to how subliminal messaging works, but with digital precision. They can't override your core values, but they can manipulate decision thresholds by creating subconscious associations. Exactly how the Russians perfected psychological operations during the Cold War, but with algorithmic targeting." Give me a concrete example, Mira pressed. Alexandra was silent for a moment. The Westlake election, she said finally, 2 years ago. The patterns were embedded in campaign ads, social media content, even the lighting sequences at rallies. The goal wasn't to change committed voters' minds, but to influence the undecided, particularly those who consumed most of their information through digital channels. Owen paused in his sandwich making, struck by the implication. The Westlake election had been a turning point in the country's political landscape, a surprise victory that had shifted the balance of power dramatically. Can you prove this? Mira asked, her voice carefully neutral. It's all on the drive, Alexandra confirmed. The implementation plan, the target, demographics, the effectiveness metrics. They tracked everything, measured success rates down to precinct level. Owen glanced at Sophie, relieved to find her focused on carefully cutting crusts off her sandwich, apparently not absorbing the disturbing conversation nearby. Or perhaps he reflected, simply filing it away like she did everything else, processing in her own way on her own timeline. When it was his turn before the camera, Owen found himself struggling to articulate the personal dimensions of the story. How did one explain the grief of losing a spouse, the paranoia that followed the years of wondering if he'd missed something crucial? Take your time, Mira encouraged, her interviewing style shifting to accommodate his less polished delivery. Start with when you first suspected Rebecca's death wasn't an accident. Owen gathered his thoughts. It wasn't one moment, he began, more like a series of small inconsistencies. The investigation that wrapped up too quickly, the technical data that went missing, the way certain colleagues stopped returning my calls after I asked questions. He described the months following Rebecca's funeral, his increasing isolation at NASA, the sudden revocation of his security clearance, the gradual realization that he was being systematically pushed out. I started keeping records, he explained, copies of emails, notes from conversations, anything that might connect to what Rebecca had been working on. But it wasn't until I found her private journal that I began to understand. What did the journal contain? Mira asked. Owen hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small worn notebook. Mostly technical notes, flight data observations about the neural interface system she was testing. He opened it carefully, but there were also these. He showed Mira a page where Rebecca had drawn patterns of stars, interspersed with musical notation, crude versions of what Sophie had produced that morning. I didn't understand their significance at the time, Owen admitted. I thought they were just doodles. Rebecca always had a visual way of thinking through problems. When did you make the connection to Sophie's drawings? Not until Alexandra showed up. Owen glanced toward the kitchen where his daughter was now sitting with Alexandra, both of them bent over a new drawing. Sophie's always been artistic, always drawn stars and patterns. I never thought to connect it to Rebecca's work. Mira followed his gaze, her expression softening slightly. And now, how do you feel knowing your wife encoded crucial information in your daughter's memory? The question struck at the heart of the ambivalence Owen had been wrestling with since Alexandra's revelation. He was silent for a long moment, considering. I understand why she did it, he said finally. Rebecca knew they were watching her, knew her devices, her home. Everything was probably compromised. Sophie was the one pure channel she had, the one connection they couldn't monitor or control. He took a deep breath. I wish she could have trusted me with it too. The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. Mira let it sit for a respectful moment before continuing. And Alexandra Hayes, did you know of her connection to your wife before she appeared at Meridian Tower? Owen shook his head. Rebecca mentioned consulting with DataSphere engineers, but never by name. Alexandra was just another tech CEO to me until 2 days ago. Yet you chose to help her, to bring her into your home, to involve your daughter in what is clearly a dangerous situation. Mira's tone wasn't accusatory, merely seeking understanding. Why? Owen considered the question, his gaze drifting to where Alexandra sat with Sophie. There was something in the way she listened to his daughter, her complete attention focused on Sophie's explanation of her drawing, that resonated with him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Because she was willing to lose everything to expose the truth, he said simply. I recognize that kind of conviction. It's what got me blacklisted from the industry I loved. He met Mira's eyes directly, and because Rebecca trusted her, that's enough for me. The interview concluded shortly after, with Mira requesting one final segment with all of them together, including Sophie, in a limited capacity voice only, no identifying visuals. As they prepared for this last recording, Elena pulled Owen aside, her expression grave. "We have a problem," she said in a low voice. "One of my contacts just called. Datasphere has deployed a team to this region. They're systematically checking remote properties within a 3-hour radius of the city." Owen felt a chill settle in his stomach. How did they narrow it down? Cell tower pings traffic, we see Burroughs' predictive algorithms. Elena's mouth twisted ironically. They're using their own technology to hunt Alexandra. How much time do we have? Hours, not days. Elena glanced toward Mira, who was adjusting her camera setup. We need to finish this and move. Today. Owen nodded, processing this development. We should split up. Different destinations, different routes. Already planning it, Elena confirmed. I have another property, a condo in the city registered under a corporate entity, high security building, underground parking. We can regroup there. As they rejoined the others, Owen noticed Alexandra watching him, her expression questioning. He gave a small shake of his head later and turned his attention to helping Sophie prepare for her part in the recording. Remember, Bug, just like we talked about, he said gently. You don't have to show your face. Just explain your drawings and the song you've been hearing in your dreams. Sophie nodded solemnly. Will it help, Mom? She asked quietly. The question caught Owen off guard. What do you mean? In my dreams, she's always trying to finish something, Sophie explained, like she's singing but can't reach the high notes. Will this help her finish the song? Owen felt his throat tighten. Yes, he managed. I think it will. The final recording went smoothly, with Sophie explaining her drawings and the musical patterns with a clarity that seemed beyond her years. Mira asked gentle, appropriate questions, never pushing too hard and allowing the child to express her understanding in her own terms. When it was done, Mira began packing her equipment with efficient movements. I'll need about 24 hours to compile everything, verify the technical details, and prepare the publication package, she explained. Once it goes live, it will be picked up by international outlets within hours. We may not have 24 hours, Elena interjected, explaining the situation with the Datasphere search teams. Mira absorbed this information with professional calm. Then we accelerate. I have colleagues who can help with the verification process. She turned to Alexandra. The technical aspects of the kill switch, can you explain them in layman's terms for the article? Something readers will understand. Alexandra nodded. It's essentially a vaccine for the mind, she said. A pattern that once heard or seen inoculates against the influence algorithms. It creates a sort of neural interference that blocks the trigger sequences from taking effect. And it works. You're certain. Based on Rebecca's research, yes. Alexandra glanced at Sophie's drawings. We haven't had a chance to test it in real-world conditions, but the theoretical framework is sound. Mira packed the last of her equipment. I'll establish secure communication protocols before I leave. No direct contact unless absolutely necessary. She hesitated, then added, You should know this will make you targets beyond what you've experienced so far. Once the story breaks, Datasphere will use every resource at their disposal to discredit you. We know, Owen said simply. Not just professionally, Mira pressed. Personally. They'll dig into your past, your relationships, anything they can weaponize. Her gaze moved between Owen and Alexandra meaningfully, including any connections between you that might undermine your credibility. Owen frowned. What connections? We barely knew each other before this week. Mira and Elena exchanged a glance that suggested they knew something he didn't. What? Owen demanded. Elena sighed. Mira's investigation uncovered something we should discuss before the story goes public. She turned to Alexandra. Do you want to tell him, or should I? Alexandra's composure faltered for the first time since Owen had met her. She looked stricken, almost trapped. Tell me what, Owen insisted. Alexandra took a deep breath. Rebecca and I weren't just colleagues, she said quietly. Before she met you, before I took over Datasphere, we were involved. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Owen stared at her, trying to process this new information to integrate it with everything else he thought he knew. Romantically involved, he clarified, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Alexandra nodded, her eyes never leaving his. For nearly 2 years. It ended amicably when she met you. We remained friends, collaborators. She swallowed visibly. I never stopped caring about her. Owen felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. This explains so much: Alexandra's dedication to completing Rebecca's work, her immediate connection with Sophie, the emotional undertone he'd sensed whenever she spoke of his wife. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice level, aware of Sophie watching from across the room. "I was going to," Alexandra said, "but then everything happened so fast and it seemed irrelevant to what we're facing." She hesitated. "I didn't want it to change how you saw Rebecca, or me." Before Owen could respond, the distant sound of vehicles on the gravel road, sound leading to the cabin, cut through the tension. Elena moved swiftly to the window. "Two SUVs, she reported, her voice tight. Black, no markings. Half a mile out and approaching fast. The atmosphere in the cabin transformed instantly from emotional revelation to tactical urgency. "Back exit," Elena directed, already moving. "Through the trees to the dock. I keep a boat ready." She turned to Mira. "Take the hard drive. Get the story out no matter what happens to us." Mira nodded grimly, accepting the drive from Alexandra and securing it in an inner pocket of her jacket. Owen crossed to Sophie, gathering her sketchbook and backpack. "Time to go bug," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Remember our comet drill? We need to be very quiet and very fast." Sophie nodded, her eyes wide but not panicked. She slipped her hand into his with complete trust. As they moved toward the back door, Owen caught Alexandra's gaze. There was so much unresolved between them now. So many questions he didn't have time to ask. But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was survival, protection, the completion of what Rebecca had started. "Later," he said simply, and she nodded in understanding. Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows through the trees as they made their way quickly toward the dock. Behind them, the sound of vehicles growing closer lent urgency to their movements. At the water's edge, Elena untied a sleek motorboat partially concealed by overhanging branches. "Get in," she directed. "I'll take you down lake to the State Park Marina. We can separate there, take different routes to the city." As they boarded, Owen lifted Sophie into the boat, settling her in the middle seat where she would be most secure. Alexandra hesitated at the dock edge, looking back toward the cabin where Mira was presumably exiting via another route. "She'll be fine," Elena assured her. "Mira knows how to disappear." Alexandra nodded and stepped into the boat. As Elena started the motor on, Owen heard the SUVs reaching the cabin, clearing car doors, opening, and voices calling out commands. Then they were moving the boat, cutting through the water with surprising speed, curving around a bend in the shoreline that quickly took them out of sight of the cabin. Sophie pressed against Owen's side, her small body tense but controlled. "Are those the bad people?" she whispered. "Yes," Owen answered honestly. "But they won't catch us." Alexandra sat opposite them, her expression haunted as she watched the shoreline recede. The revelation of her past with Rebecca hung between them like an invisible barrier, complicating an already complex situation. As the boat picked up speed, the wind whipping past them, Owen found himself wondering how many more revelations awaited, how many more connections existed that he hadn't yet discovered. The world he thought he understood was unraveling strand by strand, revealing a pattern underneath that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. Like stars forming constellations, like notes forming a melody, like truth finding its way to the surface despite all attempts to suppress it. The city rose before them as evening fell, a skyline of glass and steel, silhouetted against the darkening skylights beginning to flicker on in office buildings and apartments. From the highway approaching downtown, it looked almost beautiful, a constellation of human creation. Owen knew better. Having spent the past 3 years in its shadows, he understood how easily one could disappear here, how thoroughly systems could erase an identity, a history, a truth. He drove carefully, obeying all traffic laws, keeping to the speed limit, despite the urgency thrumming through him. The rental car obtained with in one of Elena's many alternate IDs was deliberately unremarkable, the kind of sedan that blended into urban traffic without drawing a second glance. Beside him, Sophie dozed, exhausted from the day's events. In the back seat, Alexandra sat in silence, her attention divided between watching for potential pursuit and monitoring the secure messaging app on the burner phone Elena had provided. They had separated at the State Park Marina as planned, Elena taking Mira in one direction, Owen and Alexandra heading with Sophie in another. The plan was to reconvene at Elena's secure condo, approaching from different routes, staggered arrivals to avoid pattern recognition. "Any updates?" Owen asked quietly, glancing in the rearview mirror. Alexandra checked the phone again. "Mira's made it to her safe location. She's already compiling the story." A pause. Elena's running counter-surveillance measures before heading to the condo. She'll meet us there in approximately 2 hours. Owen nodded, focusing on navigating through increasingly dense traffic as they approached the downtown core. Neither of them had addressed the revelation about Alexandra's past with Rebecca. There hadn't been time, and with Sophie always present, it wasn't a conversation they could have freely. Take the next exit, Alexandra directed, studying the map on her phone. We're approaching from the east side as planned. As Owen signaled and moved into the exit lane, Alexandra continued, the building has an underground garage with no external surveillance feed. Elevator requires a key fob, which Elena has left for us in a lockbox near the service entrance. The precision of her instructions reminded Owen of her corporate background, the CEO accustomed to orchestrating complex operations to having her directives followed without question. It was a strange counterpoint to the vulnerability she'd shown earlier, the hesitation when her past with Rebecca was exposed. You're good at this, he observed. Crisis management. A hint of a smile crossed her face. I've run disaster scenarios for Datasphere for years. Never imagined I'd be on the other side of one. They fell silent again as Owen navigated through narrower city streets, following Alexandra's occasional directions. Sophie stirred but didn't wake her face peaceful in sleep, despite everything they'd been through. She's remarkably resilient, Alexandra said softly, watching the child. Rebecca would be proud. The mention of his wife's name hung between them, unavoidable now. Owen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Were you ever going to tell me, he asked, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Sophie, about you and Rebecca? Alexandra was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said finally, when the time was right, when it wouldn't feel like a complication we couldn't afford. Owen processed this, finding it reasonable, even as part of him rebelled against the omission. Did she ever tell you about me during your friendship afterward? All the time, Alexandra admitted. How you challenged her thinking, supported her work, even when you didn't fully understand it. How you made her laugh. A pause. She loved you deeply, Owen. What we had was in the past by the time you met. Owen nodded slowly, absorbing this. And the Project Wavelength connection, was that why she consulted for Datasphere? Initially, yes. She had expertise we needed, and I trusted her implicitly. Alexandra's voice grew softer. But as she learned more about what the project had become, her participation changed from consultation to investigation. She began documenting everything, testing the limits of the system, looking for vulnerabilities. All while pretending to still be a loyal consultant, Owen surmised. She was an excellent actress when she needed to be, Alexandra confirmed. No one suspected, not even me at first. By the time I realized what she was doing, she was already deep into creating the countermeasures. They turned onto a quiet side street lined with upscale residential buildings. Alexandra directed him toward one near the end, a sleek modern structure with a discreet entrance and tinted windows. This is it, she said. Service entrance is around back. Owen circled the block once, checking for any signs of surveillance before pulling into the alley behind the building. The service entrance was unmarked, distinguishable only by a small keypad beside a metal door. I'll get the key fob, Alexandra said, already reaching for the door handle. Stay with Sophie. Wait, Owen caught her arm. We should talk about this. About Rebecca. About what happens when all this is over. Alexandra met his gaze directly. When this is over, if we succeed, my life as I knew it will be destroyed. My company, my reputation, possibly my freedom. Her voice was calm, accepting. What happens between us, whatever that might be, is secondary to completing what Rebecca started. The frankness of her assessment struck Owen. She wasn't wrong. Personal revelations, emotional complications, all of it paled in comparison to the larger stakes. Just be careful, he said, releasing her arm. We're too close to lose anyone else. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps at his concern. She nodded once and slipped out of the car, moving swiftly to the small lockbox hidden behind a utility panel. Owen watched her retrieve the key fob, noting the efficiency of her movements, the constant awareness of her surroundings. Whatever else Alexandra Hayes might be, she was a survivor, adaptive and resourceful. Much like Rebecca had been. Perhaps that was what had drawn them together initially. The thought no longer stung as it might have hours earlier. Instead, Owen found himself seeing new dimensions to his wife's life, understanding choices that had seemed inexplicable before. Rebecca's involvement with Datasphere, her increasing secretiveness in the months before her death, her insistence that Sophie learn certain songs, certain patterns. Alexandra returned to the car holding up the key fob triumphantly. "We're in. Garage entrance is at the end of the alley." Owen started the car and followed her directions to a nondescript garage door that slid open as Alexandra pressed the fob. Inside the garage was dimly lit and nearly empty, most residents apparently at work or away. They parked in a space marked guest and gathered their few belongings. Owen gently lifted the still sleeping Sophie, cradling her against his chest as they made their way to a private elevator at the back of the garage. The elevator required another key fob swipe, then ascended smoothly to the 18th floor. When the doors opened, they found themselves in a small, private foyer leading to a single apartment door. "Elena said the unit takes up half the floor," Alexandra explained, using a different key from the lockbox to open the door. "Corporate housing officially. She uses it for witnesses who need high-level protection." The apartment beyond was spacious and minimally furnished, clearly designed for function rather than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city, though heavy automated blinds could cover them completely at the touch of a button. Owen carried Sophie to one of the bedrooms, gently laying her on the bed and removing her shoes. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake exhaustion having claimed her completely. He covered her with a light blanket and stood watching her for a moment, struck by how peaceful she looked despite everything. The subway maintenance tunnels were a maze of concrete and shadow illuminated only by emergency lights that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and electrical ozone, punctuated by the distant rumble of trains passing overhead. Owen led the way, Sophie's hand firmly in his, Alexandra close behind. They moved as quietly as possible, following Judith's detailed directions toward the Cambridge Street junction, where Elena's contact awaited. The escape had been narrow. As they'd sealed the tunnel entrance behind them, they had heard the unmistakable sound of Judith's front door being breached, Walter's team arriving just minutes after their departure. Owen could only hope Judith had followed her own exit plan, disappearing into her network of academic colleagues who had long questioned Datasphere's ethics. "How much further?" Alexandra whispered, pausing to check the crude map Judith had drawn for them. "Another quarter-mile," Owen replied, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the tunnels. "There should be a service ladder coming up on the right that leads to the junction." Sophie moved silently beside him, her initial curiosity about their underground journey having given way to watchful alertness. She hadn't complained once, hadn't asked for rest, despite the difficult terrain. Something in her demeanor had shifted after the confrontation with Walter, a new solemnity that worried Owen even as he admired her resilience. They rounded a bend in the tunnel and spotted the service ladder, a rusted metal structure bolted to the concrete wall leading up to a heavy grate overhead. Owen gestured for them to stop, listening intently for any sign that the exit might be watched. "I'll go first," he whispered, releasing Sophie's hand. "Wait for my signal before following." Alexandra nodded, drawing Sophie close to her side. The girl went willingly, wrapping her arm around Alexandra's waist with the easy trust she'd developed over their days together. Owen climbed the ladder carefully, each metal rung groaning softly under his weight. At the top, he pressed his ear against the grate, listening for voices, footsteps, anything that might indicate danger. Hearing nothing, he pushed upward with measured pressure. The grate moved reluctantly, decades of corrosion protesting the disturbance. Owen lifted it just enough to peer out, finding himself in what appeared to be a disused maintenance shed. Dusty equipment lined the walls and a single door led outward. No sign of movement, no indication of surveillance. He pushed the grate fully open and climbed into the shed, taking a moment to scan the space more thoroughly before signaling down to Alexandra. She lifted Sophie to the first rungs of the ladder, then followed close behind as the girl climbed with practiced ease. Once all three were inside the shed, Owen lowered the grate back into place, hoping it looked undisturbed to casual inspection. "Now what?" Alexandra whispered, brushing dust from Sophie's shoulders. "We wait," Owen replied, checking his watch. "Elena's contact should be here in 10 minutes. They settled against the wall furthest from the door, Sophie nestled between the adults. The shed was cold, the spring morning chill seeping through the thin walls, but at least they were out of the damp tunnels. "How are you doing, Bug?" Owen asked softly, his arm around his daughter's shoulders. Sophie looked up at him, her expression serious. "I'm okay, just thinking about the star map." Owen exchanged glances with Alexandra over Sophie's head. The drawing had been hurriedly folded into his pocket during their escape, but its implications lingered in his mind. "What do you think it means?" he asked his daughter. Sophie considered this with the careful deliberation she brought to all important questions. "It's a place," she said finally. "Mom showed me in the dream. She said when the song finishes, we need to find what she left at the crossing stars." "Crossing stars," Alexandra repeated thoughtfully. "The intersection point you marked with an X," Sophie nodded. "It's where three paths meet, in the sky." Before they could pursue this further, a soft knock at the shed door brought them instantly alert. 3 taps paused, 2 taps, the pattern Elena had specified for her contact. Owen motioned for Alexandra and Sophie to stay back as he approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called softly. "Nightingale," came the response, the code word they had been told to expect. Owen cracked the door open. Outside stood a woman in her early 30s, dressed in the uniform of a transit authority worker, complete with official ID badge and utility belt. Her alert eyes and too steady posture suggested military or law enforcement training beneath the disguise. "Mitchell," she asked without preamble. Owen nodded. "And Hayes, +1. The woman Nightingale glanced past him to where Alexandra stood with Sophie. Her expression softened slightly at the sight of the child, then returned to professional detachment. "My vehicle is parked 30 meters south, Service Access Road." She handed Owen a folded transit authority jacket. "Put this on. The child should wear this." She passed him a small safety vest with Junior Inspector printed across the back. "Hayes stays as is. We're doing a routine infrastructure check if anyone asks." The disguises were simple but effective, hiding them in plain sight among the countless maintenance workers that populated the city's transit system. Owen helped Sophie into the oversized vest, which she regarded with solemn approval. "Ready?" Nightingale asked, already turning toward the exit. They followed her from the shed into early morning light. The service road ran parallel to the main transit line, separated by a chain-link fence. A white transit authority van waited where she had indicated engine running. They moved briskly but not hurriedly, maintaining the appearance of workers going about routine business. Nightingale led them to the van and opened the side door, revealing a modified interior with secure seating and privacy screens on the windows. "In," she directed. "Quickly." They climbed aboard, Sophie first, then Alexandra, finally Owen. Nightingale closed the door behind them and moved to the driver's seat, pulling away from the curb with calm efficiency. "Where are we going?" Owen asked as they settled into the secure seating. "First to a switching point," Nightingale replied without turning. "Change vehicles, change appearance. Then to the extraction site. You're scheduled for international transport at noon." "International," Owen repeated, surprised. Elena didn't mention leaving the country. "Plans accelerated after publication," Nightingale explained. "The story is generating more attention than anticipated. All major networks are covering it. Datasphere stock dropped 30% in pre-market trading. Federal agencies are already issuing statements." Alexandra leaned forward. "And the kill switch, is there any indication it's working?" For the first time, Nightingale smiled slightly. "Oh, it's working." Social media is filled with people reporting strange experiences after reading the article, "A moment of clarity," they're calling it. Like waking from a dream they didn't know they were having. The confirmation that Rebecca's countermeasure was functioning as intended sent a wave of vindication through Owen. It was working. People were being freed from influence they hadn't even been aware of. The truth was out, spreading, changing minds literally. "What about Walter Hayes?" Alexandra asked, her voice tight. "Any response from Datasphere leadership?" Nightingale's expression turned grim. "Emergency board meeting in progress. No official statement yet, but internal sources report Hayes is attempting to contain the damage, claiming the technology was experimental, never fully implemented, the evidence fabricated by disgruntled employees." "Standard corporate damage control," Alexandra said with bitter familiarity. "Deny, minimize, discredit the whistleblowers." "It won't work this time," Nightingale asserted. "Too much evidence, too many independent confirmations already. Plus the kill switch effect is impossible to deny once experienced." They fell silent as Nightingale navigated through increasingly busy streets. The morning was fully underway now, the city awakening to news that would fundamentally alter how its citizens understood their relationship with technology with their own minds. Sophie sat quietly between Owen and Alexandra, watching the passing scenery with thoughtful eyes. She hadn't asked where they were going, hadn't questioned the need for disguise or haste. The acceptance with which she approached each new development both impressed and concerned Owen. "You doing okay, Bug?" he asked softly. She nodded. Just listening, she said. For the song, it's getting louder. Before Owen could ask what she meant, Nightingale turned the van into an underground parking garage, descending to a lower level before pulling into a secluded corner where another vehicle waited, a nondescript family SUV with tinted windows. Transfer point, she announced, parking alongside the waiting vehicle. You have 3 minutes to change and switch vehicles. She passed back a bag containing new clothes for each of them, casual tourist attire, that would blend in at airports or train stations. They changed quickly, helping Sophie with her new outfit, a simple dress with leggings and a hooded sweatshirt. The new vehicle has child safety seats and family luggage, Nightingale informed them as they prepared to transfer. You're the Chen family returning from visiting relatives. Documents are in the glove compartment. Memorize the details before you reach the extraction point. Owen paused, hand on the van door. Who are you? He asked. Really? Nightingale met his gaze in the rearview mirror. Someone who believes in what you're doing, she said simply. Someone who's seen the influence technology from the inside. The admission suggested deeper connections, more complex motivations than a simple operative following Elena's instructions. But there was no time to explore further. Nightingale checked her watch pointedly. 30 seconds, she reminded them. They transferred quickly to the waiting SUV, finding it exactly as described. Child seat installed, family luggage visible, even toys scattered in the back seat to complete the illusion. As Owen started the engine, Nightingale approached his window with a final instruction. Head north on I-93, exit at Sullivan Square. Your extraction contact will be at the designated location. She handed him a paper with an address. Commit it to memory, then destroy this. Owen nodded, scanning the address and passing it to Alexandra before tearing the paper into tiny pieces. Thank you, he said to Nightingale, for everything. She stepped back from the vehicle. Good luck, Mr. Mitchell. Miss Hayes. Her gaze shifted to Sophie in the back seat. Little star singer. The nickname, so specific, so knowing, caught Owen off guard. But before he could question it, Nightingale was walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the parking garage. They pulled out onto the street, merging into morning traffic that seemed surreally normal given the circumstances. All around them, people were going about their daily routines, unaware that the three fugitives in the family SUV were at the center of what was rapidly becoming the largest tech scandal in history. Alexandra checked her phone, a new burner provided in the SUV, accessing news sites to monitor the unfolding situation. It's everywhere, she reported, scrolling through headlines. Every major outlet, government agencies issuing statements, tech experts analyzing the influence patterns, datasphere stock in freefall. She looked up, a mixture of vindication and apprehension in her expression. It's really happening, Owen. Exactly as we hoped. And Walter, he asked, eyes on the road as he navigated toward the interstate. Alexandra's expression darkened. No direct statement yet, but there are reports of unusual activity at Datasphere headquarters. Employee badges deactivated, security teams deployed, servers being physically removed from the building. Destroying evidence, Owen surmised. Trying to, Alexandra agreed, but it's too late. The core data is already public, being verified by independent experts. The kill switch is spreading faster than they can contain it. She scrolled further. There's already a congressional committee being formed to investigate. Securities and Exchange Commission announcing a formal inquiry. The scale of the impact was difficult to process. What had begun as a personal quest for truth about Rebecca's death had escalated into a full-blown exposure of corporate and political manipulation on an unprecedented scale. What about us? Owen asked. Any mentions? Alexandra checked several more sources. Nothing specific yet. The article credits anonymous whistleblowers with direct knowledge of the technology, mirrors protecting our identities as promised. For now, Owen said grimly. But once Walter recovers from the initial shock, he'll make sure everyone knows who's responsible. Alexandra nodded in agreement, which is why we need to be well away from here before that happens. In the back seat, Sophie had been quiet, staring out the window at the passing city. Now she spoke up, her voice carrying clearly to the front seat. He's already looking for us, she said matter-of-factly. The bad man. He's deployed his Tier 1 surveillance team, the same unit that tracked whistleblowers across 3 continents. They're using SIGINT capabilities that even the NSA restricted after the church committee hearings. Owen glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. How do you know that, Bug? Sophie shrugged slightly. I can feel it, like a buzzing in the air. She traced patterns on the window with her finger. But he can't find us if we follow the stars. The certainty in her voice was unsettling. Owen exchanged glances with Alexandra, seeing his own concern mirrored in her expression. Sophie's intuition had proven remarkably accurate throughout this ordeal, her connection to Rebecca's work extending beyond mere memory into something more profound. "We're following the stars right now," Alexandra assured her, turning in her seat to face Sophie directly. "Just like your mom wanted us to." Sophie nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. She returned to looking out the window, her small face solemn but not frightened. They continued north, merging onto I-93 as instructed. Traffic thickened as they approached the city center, commuters heading to pubs that might soon be disrupted by the revelations spreading through news channels and social media. "I wonder how many of them have read the article already," Alexandra mused, watching the other vehicles around them. "How many have been exposed to the kill switch without even realizing it? And how many will notice the difference?" Owen added. "The absence of influence they never knew was there." It was a profound thought, people suddenly freed from subtle manipulation, experiencing true autonomy of thought, perhaps for the first time in years. Would they recognize the change? Would they understand what had been happening to them? As they approached the Sullivan Square exit, Owen checked the address they'd been given, once more committing the route to memory. The extraction point was in a commercial district nearby a coffee shop with rear access that would allow for discreet transfer. "Almost there," he told Alexandra and Sophie. "Everyone remember the Chen family details." Alexandra nodded. David and Lisa Chen returning from visiting grandparents in New York with daughter May. "I've memorized the passport numbers as well." "May," Sophie repeated, trying out her cover identity. "That means beautiful in Chinese." Owen smiled despite the tension. "That's right, Bug. How did you know that?" "My friend Lynn at school told me," Sophie said. "She taught me how to write it too." The casual reminder of the normal life they'd left behind, Sophie's school, her friends, the routines that had defined their existence before Alexandra's arrival, struck Owen with unexpected force. Would they ever return to that life? Would Sophie ever see her friends again? The uncertainty of their future settled over him as he exited the highway, following the directions to the extraction point. The coffee shop appeared ordinary enough, a local establishment rather than a chain, busy, but not crowded, with a small parking area behind the building. Owen drove past, once checking for anything suspicious, then circled back to approach from the rear as instructed. He parked in one of the designated spaces and turned to Alexandra. "Ready?" She nodded, gathering their minimal belongings. "We'll ever be." They exited the vehicle, Owen helping Sophie from her car seat, while Alexandra scanned the area with practiced vigilance. The rear entrance to the coffee shop was unmarked, distinguishable only by a blue door with a small nautical star painted beside the handle, the sign they'd been told to look for. Owen approached Sophie's hand and his Alexandra close behind. He knocked in the pattern they'd been given, 2 quick taps, pause, 3 more. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and the efficient posture of someone accustomed to crisis management. She scanned them quickly, nodded once, and gestured them inside. "Chen family," she said for the benefit of anyone who might overhear. "Your travel consultant is waiting." They entered a small back room that appeared to serve as both storage and staff break area. Sitting at a small table was Elena, looking tired but alert, a laptop open before her. "You made it," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Any complications?" "None so far," Owen reported as the silver-haired woman closed and locked the door behind them. "Nightingale got us here without incident." Elena nodded, unsurprised. "She's one of our best." She gestured for them to sit at the table. "We don't have much time. The situation is evolving rapidly." "The story seems to be having the impact we hoped," Alexandra said, taking a seat while Owen helped Sophie into a chair beside her. "More than hoped," Elena confirmed, turning her laptop to show them a real-time analytics dashboard. "The article has been viewed over 5 million times in less than 3 hours. The kill switch has been deployed successfully in approximately 87% of those exposures." "And Datasphere?" Owen asked. Elena's expression turned grim. "In full meltdown. Trading halted after a 40% drop. FBI serving warrants at their headquarters and data centers. Walter Hayes attempted to leave the country an hour ago, private jet to a non-extradition location. He was detained at the airport." This news hit Alexandra visibly, her composure faltering for the first time since Owen had known her. "They arrested my father." Detained for questioning, Elena clarified. No formal charges yet, but they're coming. The evidence is too overwhelming to ignore. Alexandra absorbed this with complex emotions playing across her features. Vindication mixed with grief, relief, with regret. Whatever Walter Hayes had become, whatever crimes he had committed, he was still her father. The man who had nurtured her talent, built a company with her, shared her vision before corrupting it. I'm sorry, Owen said quietly, understanding something of what she must be feeling. The satisfaction of justice tempered by the personal cost. Alexandra shook her head slightly. Don't be. This is what needs to happen. She straightened, refocusing on Elena. What's our next step? International transport is planned, Elena replied. We have a private charter waiting at a small airfield north of the city. It will take you to a secure location where you can monitor developments and prepare for the next phase. Next phase? Owen questioned. Testimony, Elena explained. Once federal investigations are formally underway, you'll both be key witnesses. But that's weeks away at the earliest. For now, your safety remains the priority. The silver-haired woman who had admitted them, clearly some kind of security personnel, approached the table with a tablet. Satellite imagery shows no unusual activity at the airfield, she reported. Transport route appears clear. Elena nodded her thanks. We'll move in 15 minutes. Different vehicle, different cover identities. She slid a folder across the table to Owen. Memorize these. Destruction protocols in effect for all previous documentation. As Owen opened the folder examining the new identity papers, a thought struck him. Mira, he said, is she secure of fully, Elena assured him. She implemented her own protective protocols the moment the story went live. She's experienced with high-risk publications. Owen nodded, relieved. Their alliance with the journalist had been brief but crucial. Her willingness to put herself at risk to publish the truth deserved protection. Sophie, who had been quietly observing the adults' conversation, suddenly spoke up. Can I have some paper? I need to draw something. Elena looked surprised by the request, but recovered quickly. Of course, Yahi. She produced a notepad and pen from her bag, sliding them across to Sophie. The girl began drawing immediately, her focus, absolute small hand moving with surprising surety across the page. Owen recognized the intensity of her expression, the same concentrated focus she exhibited when transcribing Rebecca's patterns from her dreams. What are you drawing, Bug? He asked gently. The next part of the map, Sophie replied without looking up. It came to me just now, very clear. Owen and Alexandra exchanged glances over Sophie's head. Elena watched with curious interest, clearly not fully briefed on this aspect of their situation. Map, she inquired quietly. Sophie has been receiving information, Alexandra explained in an undertone. Patterns, coordinates encoded in what appear to be star configurations. We believe they're further instructions from Rebecca beyond the kill switch. Elena's expression registered surprise, then thoughtful consideration. Like a backup plan, or the next phase of whatever she was building, Owen suggested. The kill switch may just be the beginning. Sophie finished her drawing with a definitive final stroke, then pushed the notepad toward the center of the table. There, she said. Now we can see the whole path. The adults leaned in to examine what she had created. It was another star chart, but more detailed than the previous one, with multiple constellations clearly identifiable. The three bright stars that had formed a triangle in her earlier drawing were present again, but now connected to additional points, forming a more complex pattern. And at the center where the lines intersected, she had drawn not just an X, but a small circle around it with radiating lines like a stylized sun. These are actual celestial coordinates, Alexandra said, studying the drawing with her scientist's eye. Precise enough to locate a specific point in the night sky. But what's there? Elena asked. A star, a planet. Something else, Sophie said with certainty. Mom called it the lighthouse. The term sent a jolt of recognition through Owen. The Lighthouse Project, he murmured. It was one of Rebecca's classified assignments at NASA. She couldn't tell me details, but I knew it involved satellite technology. Alexandra's eyes widened. Satellite, she repeated. Of course, these aren't just coordinates in the abstract sense, they're orbital positions. She looked at Sophie with newfound understanding. Your mom encoded the location of a satellite. Sophie nodded as if this were obvious. The lighthouse shows the way home. The security woman approached again, checking her watch meaningfully. Time to move, she announced. Vehicle is in position. Elena gathered her laptop quickly. We need to go. We can analyze this further at the secure location. Owen helped Sophie collect her drawing, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket alongside the earlier version. Whatever Rebecca had hidden at these coordinates, whatever the lighthouse might be, would have to wait until they reached safety. As they prepared to leave, Sophie tugged at Alexandra's sleeve. It's getting louder, she said. What is, sweetie? Alexandra asked, bending to the child's level. The song, Sophie replied. It's everywhere now. Can't you hear it? Alexandra hesitated, then closed her eyes briefly as if listening for something beyond normal perception. When she opened them again, there was a new clarity in her gaze. Yes, she said softly. I think I can. The airfield was small and private, tucked away in the rolling countryside north of the city. A single runway stretched across well-maintained grass, a handful of hangars clustered at one end. Their approach was cautious, Elena's security team conducting counter-surveillance measures, ensuring they hadn't been followed from the coffee shop. The aircraft waiting for them was modest, a twin-engine private plane with capacity for perhaps 8 passengers. Its unassuming appearance was deliberate, Alexandra suspected, designed to attract minimal attention during takeoff and landing. Where exactly are we going? Owen asked, as they approached the plane, Sophie's hand firmly in his. Better you don't know until we're airborne, Elena replied. Operational security. The answer wasn't entirely satisfying, but Owen nodded in acceptance. After everything they'd been through, a few more hours of uncertainty seemed a small price for safety. The pilot met them at the base of the boarding stairs, a weathered man in his 60s with the calm demeanor of someone who had flown through literal and figurative storms. Weather's clear all the way, he reported to Elena. Estimated flight time just under 3 hours. 3 hours placed them somewhere in eastern Canada. Alexandra calculated. Far enough to cross international borders, close enough to return quickly if needed for testimony. They boarded efficiently, finding the interior of the aircraft comfortably appointed, but not luxurious. Sophie immediately claimed a window seat, her face pressed to the glass as she watched the ground crew make final preparations. Owen settled beside his daughter, while Alexandra took the seat across the narrow aisle. Elena positioned herself near the front of the cabin, already on her phone coordinating final security details. Nervous? Alexandra asked Owen, noting the tension in his posture as the engines began to warm up. About flying? No. He glanced at Sophie, then back to Alexandra. About beneath the silent waves. 5 years had passed since the Savannah disappeared from the headlines. Ethereum had been dismantled, following congressional hearings with dozens of executives facing criminal charges. The manipulation algorithms had been purged from every device, and new digital privacy laws had been enacted worldwide. On a quiet autumn afternoon, Graham parked in front of the small lakeside house where a gardening woman was planting the season's last flowers. Marley, now 13, was the first to jump out of the car and run to embrace Savannah. Did you get those tomatoes to grow? Marley asked, looking down at the vegetable beds. Savannah smiled. Plenty, stubborn like I said, but sometimes the most stubborn things are the most worthwhile. Graham approached carrying a book in both hands. We brought this for you, he said, handing it to her. It was a thick hardcover. Beneath the silent waves, the truth about the quiet revolution that saved democracy. They want you at the signing, Marley said, eyes bright. Not as Savannah, but as the anonymous source. Savannah flipped through the pages, stopping at the dedication to those who don't let their voices disappear beneath the noise, and to a little girl who drew wings when the world had forgotten how to fly. You didn't have to do this, she said, her voice catching. No, Graham replied, but it's a story worth telling, not about perfect heroes, but about ordinary people brave enough to speak truth no matter the cost. As they walked inside the small house, Marley ran ahead to set up the piano for her monthly music lesson. The melody she played was no longer a secret code, but a beautiful composition created by a woman who saw danger coming and chose to act. Graham stood beside Savannah, watching his daughter. Sometimes I wonder if the world understands what they almost lost, he said. They don't need to understand, Savannah answered. They just need to be free to make their own decisions. She turned to look at him. And you, Graham Hollis, do you ever regret it? Graham shook his head, looking around the warm room with Marley's drawings on the walls, the soft piano notes, and the woman who had once been a powerful CEO now growing tomatoes and teaching science to local children. Never, he said, because this isn't a story about what we lost. It's a story about what we saved. As twilight settled over the lake, the three of them sat on the porch not as fugitives or heroes, but simply as people who had stood up when it mattered most, who had chosen conscience over comfort, and who had found in the process a kind of family none of them had dared to dream of. And in a world that had grown too accustomed to whispering, they had taught each other how to speak, even when no one was listening.